Bavaria, May 1945. The refugee camp stretched across a muddy field outside Munich, canvas tents sagging under spring rain that turned everything to gray. Corporal Daniel Morrison, a medic from Oregon, was conducting routine health screenings when he saw the child. 5 years old, maybe 6. The boy weighed 32 pounds half what he should have weighed, his ribs visible through paper-thin skin, his eyes enormous in a shrunken face. Morrison knelt down with a chocolate bar, the standard gift for hungry children. The boy took it with trembling hands. Then he spoke 3 words in broken English that made Morrison's hands stop moving, made his breath catch, made him understand something about the war that no battlefield had taught him. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, its cities reduced to rubble, its military forces scattered or captured, its civilian population displaced and starving. American forces advancing through Bavaria encountered not just defeated soldiers, but millions of refugees, people fleeing from the east, from destroyed cities, from the collapse of everything they had known. The refugee processing camp outside Munich was established on May 10th to handle the flood of displaced persons requiring medical screening, documentation, and temporary shelter before being moved to more permanent facilities. It consisted of 30 large canvas tents arranged in rows, a medical station, a mess tent serving minimal rations, and ankle-deep mud created by spring rains that refused to stop. Corporal Daniel Morrison arrived there on May 12th. He was 26 years old, a trained medic who had served with the 45th Infantry Division since North Africa. He had treated combat casualties, dealt with battlefield trauma, seen young men die from wounds that might have been survivable if medical resources had been more abundant, or evacuation faster, or luck better distributed. But this was different work. Not treating acute injuries, but assessing chronic malnutrition, diagnosing diseases born from months of inadequate food, and shelter, trying to categorize levels of suffering so that the worst cases received priority care. The refugees arrived in waves families, pushing handcarts loaded with belongings. Elderly people barely able to walk, children with hollow faces and distended bellies that signaled severe protein deficiency. Morrison worked methodically through the screening process. Weight and height measurements. Visual assessment for obvious medical conditions. Brief questioning about symptoms: coughing, diarrhea, fever, pain. Categorization into 3 groups: critical requiring immediate hospitalization, moderate requiring monitoring and supplemental nutrition, stable requiring only regular rations and basic shelter. The categories felt inadequate. Almost everyone was malnourished to some degree. Almost everyone showed signs of chronic stress and deprivation. But resources were limited and triage was necessary. So Morrison made his assessments and directed people to appropriate tents and tried not to think too hard about the ones he marked as stable who were anything but. On May 15th, during afternoon screening, he saw the boy. The child stood in line with an elderly woman, his grandmother, Morrison assumed, waiting his turn for assessment. He was perhaps 5 years old, though malnutrition made age estimation difficult. His clothing hung loose on a frame that looked skeletal, his legs thin as kindling, his arms barely thicker than the wrists they connected to. When they reached the front of the line, Morrison gestured for them to approach the examination table. The woman helped the boy climb up, her movements suggesting she was also weak, also hungry, also pushed to the edge of what bodies could endure. Morrison pulled out his scale and measuring tape. Name? He asked in German, which he had learned through 3 years of interrogating prisoners and treating displaced civilians. Kurt, the woman said. Kurt Hoffman. He is 5 years old. My grandson. Morrison weighed the boy carefully, noting the number with growing concern. 32 pounds. A healthy 5-year-old should weigh 45 to 50 pounds. This child had lost nearly a third of his body mass, his body consuming itself to survive. He measured height 3 feet, 4 inches. Within normal range, suggesting the malnutrition was relatively recent rather than chronic childhood starvation. Something had happened in the past 6 months to a year that had caused this dramatic weight loss. When did he last eat properly? Morrison asked the grandmother. Her face crumpled slightly. November, maybe December. Our city was bombed. We fled east, then back west again. Food became, she gestured helplessly. There was nothing. We survived on what we could find. Roots, sometimes bread when we could beg or trade for it. Morrison examined the boy more thoroughly. Signs of scurvy, bleeding gums, loosening teeth. Evidence of rickets softening bones, bowed legs beginning to develop. Skin infections from poor hygiene and weakened immune system. Hair thinning and brill. The catalog of deprivation was comprehensive and devastating. He needs hospitalization, Morrison said. Immediate nutritional intervention. If we don't treat this aggressively, his organs will begin failing. Has he complained of pain? Difficulty breathing? He doesn't complain, the grandmother said quietly. He hasn't spoken much for weeks, just exists, like he's too tired to be a child anymore. Morrison felt something twist in his chest. He had seen death in many forms, violent, sudden, peaceful. But this slow starvation of childhood felt particularly cruel, watching a boy who should be playing and laughing and causing mischief, instead sitting silent and hollow-eyed, too exhausted by the simple work of survival to be human in the ways children were supposed to be human. He reached into his medical bag and pulled out a chocolate bar, a Hershey's bar he had been saving, one of several he kept for moments when sugar and calories and a small gesture of sweetness might matter more than standard medical intervention. For you, Morrison said to Kurt, offering the chocolate. Good food. Will make you stronger. The boy stared at the chocolate bar with an expression Morrison couldn't quite read. Not excitement exactly. Not even hunger, though he was clearly starving. Something more complicated, disbelief maybe, or fear that accepting the gift would make it disappear, or confusion about why an American soldier would offer food rather than confiscate it. Slowly, with hands that trembled from weakness or emotion or both, Kirk reached out and took the chocolate bar. He held it carefully, reverently, as if it were made of glass. Then he looked up at Morrison, meeting his eyes directly for the first time, and he spoke. 3 words in broken, heavily accented English that he had learned somewhere, somehow, during the chaos of collapse and displacement. Is this real? Morrison froze. The question was simple. 3 words. But they carried implications that struck him like physical force. The boy wasn't asking if the chocolate was actual chocolate, rather than a substitute. He was asking if this moment was real, if American soldiers actually gave food to starving children, if generosity could exist after months of deprivation, if the world contained kindness alongside its cruelty. He was asking if hope was real. Morrison felt tears sting his eyes unexpectedly. He had maintained professional detachment through 3 years of war, had treated terrible wounds without breaking down, had watched men die without losing his composure. But this child's question delivered in 3 small words that revealed so much about what he had experienced, what he had lost, what he no longer trusted about reality shattered something in Morrison's carefully maintained emotional armor. Yes, Morrison said, his voice rough. It's real. You can eat it. It's yours. Kurt looked at the chocolate bar again, then at his grandmother, seeking confirmation that accepting this gift was permitted. She nodded, tears running down her weathered face. The boy unwrapped the chocolate slowly, broke off a small piece, and put it in his mouth. The expression that crossed his face was transcendent pure sensory experience, unmediated by thought or expectation. Sugar and cocoa and fat, tastes his body had been deprived of for months, flooding his system with calories and pleasure and the basic recognition that food could be something other than desperate survival. He ate the piece slowly, making it last, then carefully rewrapped the rest of the chocolate bar and held it against his chest, saving it, protecting it. not trusting that more might come. Morrison had to look away, had to breathe deeply, had to gather himself before he could continue the medical assessment. When he looked back, Kurt was still clutching the chocolate, still staring at Morrison with those enormous eyes that had seen too much. "He'll be okay?" the grandmother asked quietly. "Yes," Morrison said, though the certainty was more hope than medical judgment. "We'll hospitalize him, start refeeding protocols gradually. Too much food too fast can cause complications. But he's young. His body can recover if we're careful. He'll be okay." He marked Kurt's file as critical priority, requiring immediate transfer to the field hospital. Then he helped the grandmother down from the examination table, gave her directions to the appropriate tent, and watched them walk away, the old woman supporting the skeletal boy, both of them moving slowly through mud that sucked at their inadequate shoes. After they left, Morrison sat for several minutes before calling the next refugee forward. He was supposed to be working efficiently, processing dozens of people per hour. But he needed time to process what had just happened, to understand why 3 words from a starving child had affected him more deeply than 3 years of combat medicine. Is this real? The question implied a world where reality itself had become suspect, where basic assumptions about cause and effect and human decency had been so thoroughly violated that a child could no longer trust his own perceptions, where receiving food felt impossibly unlikely, where American kindness contradicted everything he had learned to expect. Morrison thought about his own childhood in Oregon, growing up with enough food, with parents who provided, with the basic security that allowed children to be children rather than tiny, desperate survivors. He thought about what it would take to break that security so completely that a 5-year-old no longer believed in simple generosity. He thought about the war that had created this situation, the ideology that had led to it, the systems of cruelty and deprivation that reduced children to skeletons who asked if chocolate was real. And he understood, with sudden clarity, that treating Kurt's malnutrition was only the beginning. The physical damage could be healed with food and time and proper medical care. But the psychological damage, the fundamental fracturing of a child's trust in reality, that would take much longer to address, if it could be addressed at all. Kurt was transferred to the field hospital that evening, transported by ambulance, along with 3 other critical cases. Morrison accompanied them, officially because he was documenting the transfers, unofficially because he couldn't stop thinking about the boyish question and needed to see what happened next. The field hospital occupied a converted school building, classrooms transformed into wards, the gymnasium serving as surgery and intensive care. It smelled of disinfectant and unwashed bodies and the particular odor of severe illness that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. Nurses and doctors moved through hallways with exhausted efficiency, treating hundreds of cases of daily disease, malnutrition, injuries from the war's final chaos. Captain Sarah Chun, the hospital's chief pediatric nurse, met them at intake. She was 34 years old, Chinese-American, trained at Johns Hopkins before volunteering for the Army Nurse Corps. She had spent 18 months treating children affected by war orphans, wounded, malnourished, traumatized. She had developed the professional detachment necessary to function in such circumstances, the ability to see patients as medical cases requiring specific interventions rather than as individual tragedies, requiring emotional response. But when she saw Kurt, her professional mask slipped slightly. "How much does he weigh?" she asked Morrison. 32 pounds, 5 years old. Severe malnutrition, probable vitamin deficiencies, showing early signs of organ stress. Chun nodded, making notes on a clipboard. "We'll start with glucose 4 to stabilize his blood sugar, then very gradual refeeding, small amounts every 2 hours, monitoring for refeeding syndrome. Vitamin supplements. Close observation for complications." She looked at Kurt, who sat on a gurney clutching his partially eaten chocolate bar. "Has he been responsive? Communicative?" "Not much," Morrison said. Then, after a pause, he asked me if the chocolate was real. Chun's pen stopped moving. She looked up at Morrison, reading the implications in his expression. "He asked if it was real," she repeated quietly. In English, 3 words. "Is this real?" Like he couldn't trust that someone would actually give him food. Chun was silent for a moment. Then she knelt beside Kurt's gurney, bringing herself to eye level with the boy. She spoke in German, her accent competent if not fluent. "Hello, Kurt. I'm Nurse Chun. We're going to take care of you here. Give you food, make you stronger. You're safe now." Kurt stared at her with those enormous eyes, processing the words, trying to determine if they were trustworthy. Finally, he whispered, "Is this real?" "Yes," Chun said firmly. "This is real. You're in a hospital. We're going to help you get better. I promise you this is real." Kurt considered this, then looked down at his chocolate bar. He broke off another small piece and ate it slowly, savoring each taste, still not quite believing. The refeeding process required extreme care. When a body has been starving for extended periods, reintroducing food too quickly can cause refeeding syndrome, potentially fatal complication, where sudden nutrition shifts trigger electrolyte imbalances that can cause cardiac failure, respiratory distress, and organ damage. Chun started Kurt on a glucose 4 to provide immediate energy, while his digestive system was carefully reawakened. Every 2 hours, nurses brought small portions of easily digestible food broth, mashed potatoes, soft bread, perhaps 3 or 4 spoonfuls per feeding, amounts that seemed cruelly inadequate, but which represented all his damaged system could safely process. Kurt accepted the food with the same careful reverence he had shown the chocolate bar. He ate slowly, methodically, as if each spoonful might be his last, as if abundance was a temporary illusion that would disappear if he took it for granted. He didn't speak much, responded to direct questions with single words or nods, mostly just watched observing nurses, doctors, other patients, cataloging this new environment with the wariness of someone who had learned that safety was temporary and promises were unreliable. Morrison visited daily during his off hours, checking on Kurt's progress, bringing small gifts when he could: a toy soldier carved from wood by a German POW, a picture book salvaged from the school's ruined library, another chocolate bar carefully rationed into daily portions. On the 3rd day, Kurt finally asked a question beyond his haunting initial inquiry. "Where is Oma?" He whispered to Morrison during an evening visit. "My grandmother. She was with me. She's in the refugee camp," Morrison explained. "She visits twice a day, morning and evening. The nurses bring her to see you. She can't stay here because the hospital is only for patients who need intensive care, but she's close. She's safe." Kurt absorbed this information silently. Then, will she get food too? Is she real too? The question revealed his continued uncertainty about reality, his need for confirmation that the kindness extended to him wasn't isolated, that his grandmother was also receiving care. Morrison felt that familiar twist in his chest. "Yes," he said firmly. "She's getting food, regular meals. She's in a tent with a stove and blankets. She's being taken care of." Kurt nodded, some tension leaving his thin shoulders. The confirmation seemed to matter more than his own treatment, knowing that his grandmother was also safe, also fed, also real. As Kurt's physical condition stabilized, his psychological state became more apparent. He exhibited symptoms of severe trauma hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, emotional flatness, persistent anxiety about food disappearing. The nurses noted that he hoarded food when he could, hiding pieces of bread under his pillow, checking obsessively to ensure his meals would arrive as promised. Captain Chun requested a consultation with the hospital's psychiatric specialist, Dr. Robert Klein, a 38-year-old psychiatrist from New York who had been documenting the psychological effects of war on civilian populations. Klein interviewed Kurt through a translator, asking careful questions about his experiences during the past year. The story that emerged was a catalog of displacement and deprivation. Kurt's father had been drafted in 1942 sent to the Eastern Front. Never returned, presumed lost, but never officially confirmed. His mother died in November 1944 during a bombing raid on Stuttgart, where they lived. Kurt survived because he was visiting his grandmother in a nearby town. They fled east ahead of the Soviet advance, and west again as the Soviet forces continued pressing forward, caught in the massive displacement of civilians trying to escape the war's final convulsions. For 6 months, they had survived as refugees begging food where they could find it, sleeping in barns or abandoned buildings, walking endless kilometers through winter cold with inadequate clothing and no clear destination. Kurt had watched other children die from cold or hunger or disease, had seen adults become desperate enough to steal from each other, to abandon weaker family members, to commit acts of survival that contradicted every civilized norm. He learned, Dr. Klein explained to Morrison and Chun during a case review, that the world is fundamentally unsafe, that food is scarce and must be protected, that adults cannot be trusted to provide or protect, that reality itself is unreliable, that promises of safety or sustenance often prove false. So when Morrison gave him chocolate, Chun began. He couldn't integrate it into his worldview, Klein finished. It contradicted everything recent experience had taught him. Hence the question, is this real? He was literally asking if what he was experiencing matched objective reality, or if he was hallucinating, dreaming, or being deceived. Can he recover? Morrison asked. Psychologically. I mean, I know his body can heal if we feed him properly. But the mental damage... Klein was silent for a moment. Children are remarkably resilient, he said finally. Their brains are still developing, still forming patterns of understanding. If we can provide consistent safety, reliable care, evidence that the world can be trustworthy, if we can show him that reality includes kindness as well as cruelty, then yes, he can recover. But it will take time. Months, possibly years. And he'll never completely forget what he experienced. The trauma will leave marks. Kurt remained hospitalized for 3 weeks. During that time, his weight increased from 32 pounds to 41 pounds, still below. Healthy range, but moving in the right direction. His blood work improved. The signs of vitamin deficiency began reversing. His body was remembering how to function when properly nourished. But the more significant transformation was psychological. By the 2nd week, he began speaking more freely. Short sentences rather than single words. Questions about his surroundings, about when his grandmother would visit, about what would happen after he left the hospital. Small indicators of a child beginning to trust that the future might be something worth discussing. He started playing tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. A nurse brought him wooden blocks, and he built structures that he then carefully dismantled and rebuilt. Morrison showed him how to make paper airplanes, and Kurt spent hours folding and launching them, watching them glide across the ward. The hoarding behavior diminished gradually. He still checked that meals would arrive as scheduled, still showed anxiety around food, but he stopped hiding bread under his pillow. He began to trust that more food would come, that scarcity wasn't the permanent condition of existence. Most significantly, he smiled. Not often, and never without reservation, but occasionally something would strike him as amusing or pleasant, and the corners of his mouth would lift slightly. Those small smiles felt like victory's evidence that joy could survive trauma, that children's natural capacity for happiness could reassert itself when given opportunity. On May 28th, Dr. Klein conducted a final psychiatric assessment before Kurt's scheduled discharge. He asked Kurt the same question Morrison had inadvertently posed 3 weeks earlier, but in reverse. Is this real? The hospital, the food, the people taking care of you, is it real? Kurt considered the question seriously. Then he said, yes, it is real. But it is strange real. Different from before real. How is it different? Klein asked. Before real was always afraid, always hungry, always moving, never safe. Kurt paused, choosing words carefully. This reel has food every day, has bed that doesn't move, has people who say they will help, and then they help. It is better real. But still strange, because I remember other real. Klein documented this response carefully, noting it as evidence of a child developing the cognitive sophistication to hold multiple realities simultaneously. Traumatic past and the more hopeful present, both real, both shaping his understanding of the world. You're a strong boy, Klein told Kurt. You survive things that many people don't survive. And you're learning that the world can be safe again. That's very brave. Kurt nodded solemnly. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, Will you remember me? After I leave? Yes, Klein said. I will remember you. I will remember a boy who asked if chocolate was real, and who learned that kindness could be real too. Kurt was discharged on May 30th, transferred back to the refugee camp to live with his grandmother while they waited for more permanent housing arrangements. By now the refugee processing system had evolved. Temporary camps were being transformed into semi-permanent settlements. Families were being connected with housing in undamaged areas. The chaos of the immediate post-war period was gradually organizing into something approaching functionality. Morrison accompanied Kurt back to the camp, partly from medical responsibility, partly from personal investment in seeing this particular story through. They rode in the back of a supply truck, Kurt sitting beside him, his small suitcase containing clothes donated by aid organizations and a collection of small treasures accumulated during his hospitalization. The wooden soldier the picture book several chocolate bars, carefully saved. Do you remember when you first came here? Morrison asked as the truck bounced along muddy roads. 3 weeks ago? Kurt nodded. I was very hungry. Very tired. I thought. He paused, then continued quietly. I thought maybe I would die, like other children I saw die. But then you gave me chocolate and asked if it was real. And he struggled to articulate the complex emotions. I didn't know if you were real, or if I was dreaming, or if the chocolate was a trick. It wasn't a trick, Morrison said gently. It was just chocolate. From one person to another. Because you were hungry, and I had chocolate. Why? Kurt asked. The question was simple, but profound. Not just why the chocolate, but why the kindness, why the care, why Americans would help enemy children. Morrison thought about how to answer. How to explain to a 5-year-old the principles that made some people choose compassion over cruelty, that made medical professionals treat patients as human beings rather than as problems to be managed or enemies to be neglected. Because, Morrison said finally, you needed help, and we could help. That's reason enough. Kurt absorbed this, testing the logic against his experience. Then he said, in my before reel, people did not help unless they wanted something, unless helping was useful for them. This new reel is different. People help because helping is good, right? Yes, Morrison said. Helping is good. Taking care of people who need care is right. That's how the world is supposed to work. The world did not work that way before, Kurt said matter-of-factly. People were cruel. They took food from children. They left sick people to die. The world was wrong real. Morrison had no response to that. The child was correct. The world Kurt had experienced was wrong, violated every principle of civilization and human decency. All Morrison could offer was the hope that wrong real could be replaced by better real, that the world could learn from its catastrophic failures and choose differently. They arrived at the refugee camp and found Kurt's grandmother waiting outside her assigned tent. When she saw Kurt, noticeably heavier, stronger, more alert than when they had parted, she broke down crying. Kurt ran to her with more energy than Morrison had seen him display, wrapped his thin arms around her waist, let himself be held, and rocked while both of them wept. Morrison watched from a distance, giving them privacy, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that this case had triggered repeatedly. He had been part of saving this one child, had contributed to moving him from dying to living, from despair to tentative hope. It was such a small thing in the context of a war that had destroyed millions of lives. But it was also everything proof that individual actions mattered, that choosing compassion produced real effects, that the world could be better real if enough people committed to making it so. Morrison returned to his regular duties, processing refugees, treating malnutrition and disease, working through the endless casualties of war's aftermath. But he kept track of Kurt through periodic checks with the camp administration, making sure the boy and his grandmother were receiving adequate rations, that their housing situation was stable, that no complications had developed. In July, his unit was transferred to Frankfurt for occupation duty. Before leaving, he visited Kurt one final time, bringing a final gift, a small stuffed bear that another soldier was discarding. "For you," Morrison said, handing it to Kurt, "to remember that someone cared." Kurt accepted the bear carefully, holding it the way he had held the first chocolate bar reverently, as if it might disappear. "I will remember," he said. "I will remember the American soldier who gave me chocolate and asked me if it was real. I will remember that the answer was yes." "Stay strong," Morrison said. "Keep eating, keep growing. You're going to be fine." "I know," Kurt said with the confidence of a child who had survived the unsurvivable and come out the other side. "Because now I live in better real. Real where people help. Real where chocolate is real." Morrison left Bavaria in August 1945, returned to the United States in November, resumed his civilian life in Oregon. He married, had children, worked as a physician's assistant for 37 years. He never forgot Kurt Hoffman, never forgot the question that had shattered his professional detachment, never forgot the implications of a 5-year-old asking if kindness was real. In 1983, he received a letter forwarded through veterans organizations from a man named Kurt Hoffman, now 43 years old, living in Hamburg, working as a civil engineer. The letter read, "Dear Corporal Morrison, I have been trying to find you for many years. I wanted to thank you for saving my life in 1945, and more importantly, for teaching me that reality could include kindness. I was 5 years old when you gave me chocolate, and I asked if it was real. I have never forgotten that moment. It represented a turning point, the instant when I began to understand that the world of cruelty and deprivation I had experienced was not the only possible world, that human beings could choose to help each other rather than harm each other. That lesson shaped my entire life. I became an engineer because I wanted to build things rather than destroy them. I raised my children to believe that helping others is not optional, but obligatory. I have tried to create better real, wherever possible, the real where people care for each other, where resources are shared rather than hoarded, where children can trust that adults will protect them. You gave me chocolate, but more than that, you gave me hope. You showed me that after devastation, reconstruction is possible, that after cruelty, kindness can exist. That reality is not fixed, but can be shaped by the choices people make. I wanted you to know that your small act of generosity rippled forward through decades, that the boy who asked if chocolate was real grew into a man who tries to make reality better for others, that your choice to care mattered more than you probably realized. With profound gratitude, Kurt Hoffman Morrison read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his weathered face. His wife found him sitting at the kitchen table, the letter still in his hands, crying quietly. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed. "A letter," Morrison said, "from a boy I helped during the war." He remembered. After almost 40 years, he remembered. "What did you for him?" "I gave him chocolate," Morrison said, "and told him it was real." Kurt Hoffman lived until 2019, dying at age 79 after a life dedicated to civil engineering and humanitarian work. His obituary in the Hamburg newspaper mentioned his survival of wartime starvation as a child, his recovery due to American medical care, and his lifelong commitment to ensuring other children didn't experience the deprivation he had endured. His children found, among his papers, A worn stuffed bear and a carefully preserved chocolate bar wrapper dated 1945. Both were labeled in his handwriting. Evidence that reality can be kind. Evidence that people can choose mercy. Evidence that better real is possible. Daniel Morrison died in 1994, survived by his wife, 3 children, and 6 grandchildren. At his funeral, his daughter read the letter from Kurt Hoffman, explaining to mourners that her father had kept it in his desk drawer, that he had reread it frequently, that he had told the story of the boy who asked if chocolate was real to anyone who would listen. My father said, she told the assembled mourners, that this was the moment he understood what the war was really about. Not territory or politics or military strategy, but whether we would choose to build a world where 5-year-olds could trust that adults would feed them, where kindness was real rather than illusory, where humanity survived its own capacity for destruction. The chocolate bar Morrison gave Kurt on May 15, 1945, cost perhaps 15 cents. The medical care that saved his life cost perhaps $300 in 1945 currency. The total American investment in keeping one German child alive was minimal by any economic calculation. But that investment produced a man who designed water treatment facilities serving millions of people who raised children, committed to humanitarian work, who spent 74 years trying to make reality kinder for others, because someone had shown him kindness when he needed it most. The question, is this real? Echoed forward through decades. It became a measuring stick for distinguishing genuine help from false promises, authentic compassion from performance, the world as it should be from the world as it too often was. Years after the war, Kurt was asked during an interview about his most vivid wartime memory. He described the moment Morrison offered him chocolate, described his uncertainty about whether to trust what he was seeing, described the question that emerged from that uncertainty. I asked if it was real, Kurt said. Not just the chocolate, though I could barely believe someone would simply give food to a starving child, but everything, the American uniform, the medical tent, the promise of care. After months of experiencing a world where nothing good happened, where every day was about desperate survival, I needed confirmation that kindness still existed, that I wasn't hallucinating or being deceived. And the answer? The interviewer asked. The answer was yes. It was real. The chocolate was real. The care was real. The Americans who chose to help rather than ignore were real. That confirmation changed everything for me. It suggested that the world I had experienced, the world of starvation and displacement and cruelty, was not the only possible world. That better real was achievable. What does better real mean? Kurt smiled. Real where 5-year-olds don't have to ask if chocolate is real. Real where kindness is expected rather than surprising. Real where adults take care of children rather than competing with them for scarce resources. Real where we build rather than destroy, heal rather than harm, choose mercy rather than cruelty. Do we live in that reality now? Sometimes, Kurt said. Not always, not everywhere, but more than we did in 1945. We've learned some things. We've chosen better in some ways. The question, is this real? Still needs asking occasionally, when we see genuine compassion, when people help without expecting reward, when humanity transcends its worst impulses. But we can answer yes more often than we could in 1945. That's progress. That's what the war taught us. If we paid attention, the interviewer asked one final question. What would you say to Corporal Morrison if you could speak to him now? Kurt was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. Then he said, "Thank you for teaching me that reality can be kind. Thank you for showing me that people can choose to help rather than harm. Thank you for the chocolate. Yes, but more for the lesson that came with it. That lesson shaped my entire life. Everything I built, everything I taught my children, everything I tried to create in the world, it all began with 3 words and 1 answer. Is this real? Yes. Yes, it was. Yes, it is. Yes, it can be." Corporal Daniel Morrison, age 26, kneeling in a refugee camp in Bavaria, offering chocolate to a starving boy, could not have known that his simple gesture would ripple through decades, could not have predicted that 3 words from a traumatized child would become a philosophical framework for understanding kindness and reality, could not have imagined that 1 chocolate bar would be remembered and honored and used as evidence of humanity's capacity for compassion 74 years later. But the ripples happened anyway. The lesson was learned. The question was answered. Is this real? Yes, this is real.